Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. It's not especially warm in here, and I suspect the reason is that they've turned the temperature down so that we won't go to sleep. But there's no reason to go to sleep. This is going to be a fantastic session. This morning you heard Pavan outline the work of the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity project that he led. And in this masterclass, the aim is to reflect on how we can mainstream the economics of nature in both business and in public policy, globally, nationally, and locally. The aim is for you to have the maximum opportunity to ask questions of Pavan, and so I'll say very little. But I thought it might be helpful, because we've got roughly an hour and a half, if we divided the time up into certain chunks. And this can be flexible, but my thought was to spend the first 15 minutes or so on some of the analytics and ethics around the valuation of nature and ecosystem services, because there's some very fundamental issues there, including those around discounting and so forth. And then to spend the next block of time on issues around the kind of policy changes that are needed to ensure that we take proper account of the value of natural capital and ecosystem services. Spend the third block of time on the implications for business, and the fourth block of time on the implications for citizens and other issues. So that's the plan. The first session on analytical, conceptual, and ethical issues around valuation of natural capital and ecosystem services, then public policy, then business, and then the role of citizens and other matters. And so if you could think about where in that sort of framework you would like to ask a question, that would be helpful. We don't have to be rigid about this, but I just thought if we organize things in a little bit in that kind of way, it might be useful. So if we start with the broader issues around the analytics and the ethics of valuation, Pavan laid out this morning some of the core issues there, including the fact that we need to be careful how we go about valuing nature, and we need to recognize that we can't put a sort of a final dollar price on nature. And I would perhaps just begin, and then please feel free to come forward to the microphones and get ready for asking questions. But if I could begin, Pavan, and just say, to ask you, if you could just say a little bit more about the ethics of valuation from your perspective, and some of the pitfalls that we need to be wary of.
I think the ethics are fundamental to the valuation, and as I said, valuation itself is a human institution. By institution, I mean a bit the way that Douglas North, the economist, defined institutions as rules of the road. Some can be formal, like laws and regulations and taxes and constitutions and market regulations, and others can be informal, like customs and practices. And these institutions are really what shape our thinking and behavior towards each other and towards society and towards the environment. So in that sense, valuation is an institution. Now, if you accept that, then you realize what kind of society you are will determine what kind of institution it is, and therefore what kind of valuation you get. Now, you may be a bit like us, like largely a Judeo-Christian westernized society, where we see ourselves probably as custodians of the planet's resources, and we see ourselves hopefully as responsible custodians. And we might come to the view that, well, yes, we have to conserve and we have to ensure that these assets are maintained for us and for future generations, and then you might, on the basis of that, decide how to value, what to value, and which discount rates to apply. Or you could be in a different context. You could be part of a tribal society which lives in the forest, and you might come to a totally different idea, which is that we are part of the forest. It does not belong to us. We belong to it. And your response to valuation would be completely different as a result of that. So there's that aspect of the cultural context of valuation. Then you have to look at if we are talking about ourselves, as in, yes, we are Judeo-Christian, and broadly speaking, and we look at a sort of Cartesian, as the word is, a Cartesian approach to valuation, which is looking at what values are generated by nature for the benefit of society and for the economy, and we add them up. Then you have to start worrying about how do we add them up, and how do we compare values today versus values tomorrow? Because if you have an ecosystem and you wish to use up part of it for some other purpose, which is generating good for society, the answer is not, well, you can't touch anything, in which case it would be difficult to live. But how do you compare the value of an ecosystem which is delivering nutrients and fresh water to the fields and generating opportunity for visits and providing biodiversity and so on and so forth, today versus 25 years from now versus 50 years from now, what discount rate per annum would you apply? Should it be 10%? No, it's too much. Should it be 4%? Yeah, typical environmental economics. When we did the TEEB project, the initial interim report, we went through 27, 28 studies to look at the use of discounting. And we found that on average, they had used a discount rate of about 4%. And some of the high ones were 10, 20%, and that was it. So we took 4% as a typical mean to comment on. And we realized very quickly that valuation itself is about ethics, and within that, discounting is further about ethics. Because if you use 4% as your discount rate, and this is just arithmetic, if you take 0.96 times 0.96 times 0.96, 50 times, you end up at 0.14, which means, in other words, 1/7, which means that you are valuing a service to your granddaughter at 1/7 of what you value it to yourself. Now, I can't stand in front of my daughters and tell them this is how I think if I use a 4% discount rate. Can you? So then the question is valuation about a particular arithmetical logic, or is it about ethics and intergenerational equity and intergenerational ethics? And that's when it gets really interesting and quite complex. So these are some of the issues when you, firstly, when you decide that actually what you're looking at valuation is Cartesian approach, is Judeo-Christian, is this concept of, yes, we are custodians of nature. And then within that, when you start using discounting, you realize that you've up into another realm of ethical judgment within the institution of valuation. Of course, you could be a tribal community where you all just get together in a room and decide you're going to do this with this part of the forest and that with that part. And I've seen this. There's one way of, it's basically a choice experiment which we set up with some communities where literally they're given stones to put against the choices, as in we keep this much of the forest and that much we give up, or we keep a different amount of the forest and that much we give up to the coffee plantation or to the timber company, and put stones representing the value that you attach to that choice. And then the one with the most stones is basically the choice. So you could be sitting in a room doing that instead. That's also valuation. If anyone is interested to pursue that, one of our lectures on TEEB at Yale, I'd constructed a postgraduate course, which is not as intimidating as it sounds. It's quite fun, actually. So if anyone is interested and has the time, log into TEEB at Yale, and you'll find one of the lecturers addresses exactly this example. So all that is valuation.
I can see somebody waiting to ask a question, so just one very quick follow-up. The Stern Review used a discount rate, at least in its initial work, of 1.4%, which was regarded as ridiculously low by many people. I just wondered, Pavan, what your own view is about what is an appropriate discount rate, particularly when we're dealing with potential impacts that will run over hundreds, if not thousands, or tens of thousands of years.
So Stern's, the reason for his using 1.4 was that in theory, in economic theory, there's an equation called the Ramsay's equation, which expresses the discount rate. And there are two components to it. One is time preference. In other words, how much do you value something today versus something a year from now versus 2 years from now, etc. And the other is basically the rate of per capita GDP growth, on the logic that if you're producing more goods and services per capita in the future, then by definition, they'd be worth less per person in terms of utility. So 1.3% was the per capita rate of GDP growth that he had used, and 0.1% was the time preference, which is actually quite a respectful time preference. It's not much preferring something today versus a year, 10 years down the line. And the reason he was doing that is that these are what we call social rates of discount. Now, you and I might have bank balances which we discount at whatever the interest rate is. And you and I may have assets, as in land or a car or whatever, which we discount at different rates. But by that I mean choice of having it today versus a year or 2 years down the line. I have an old BlackBerry, which is 4 years old, which I would discount at 0%, in fact positive, because the longer it lasts, the more valuable it becomes. It has more telephone numbers. You know, the barrier of converting from old BlackBerry to new iPhone, I'm about 50 years old. So there's a huge cost in that, you know. So to me, there's a positive discount rate. In my old BlackBerry, I do everything possible to conserve it. And if I go diving, I'll take the iPhone, not the BlackBerry, because that has to be kept safe. And so it just matters. So discounting is all about all those things. Now, Stern used 1.4 for this reason, and I would argue that the 0.1 is about right in terms of time preference, because if you do the 0.1, then you will not get to the absurd 1:7 ratio in 50 years. You'll get whatever you get. The 1.3 I would challenge for nature, because unlike factories and economies which produce goods and services and probably will produce more per capita and GDP may grow, the fact is nature isn't producing on average more per capita per year. In fact, it's producing less because we are depleting nature. So why are you using a high rate of a high as in non-zero or even positive rate of discount? By the same logic of economics, if you're producing less of something per year per capita, you should not be using a positive discount rate, you should be using a negative discount rate. Actually, it should be a premium, not a discount. So these are real issues. I mean, this is not theory, this is now the area of debate as to why should we use a positive discount rate in the first instance.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you. That's really very significant. I think you have a question, Jeff.
I took, taking on board your point that value is an institution and culturally grounded, and that we've moved from, say, a tribal society to a market society. When one thinks about a market society, it's not in fact a society in which everything is done by the market. It's a society in which there are spheres of activity. There's the moral and the political and the religious and the recreational and so on. And the market only extends to a certain number of those activities before it runs out of steam. So I guess the question I'd like you to address is how to fix the limits to which you may reasonably go in using the measuring rod of money, which is central to the market, to apply to values which are not market values, are not marketable values, in fact are not expressible in money in any really meaningful way. And as one pushes further out beyond the legitimate boundary, one gets more and more artificial in the way in which you're using money to capture things that are not monetary at all. So I just wonder if you could draw the boundaries around your methodology.
Sure. So first, very good question, and thank you for that. So first, as you said, the issue of what are marketable assets and liabilities. Basically, a market is there to trade private claims, and it's not there to trade public goods and services. Purpose of the market and the construction of the market as an institution is it trades privately owned assets. I own something, I wish to sell it, I bring it to the market, you buy it, you pay me money. Conversely, I come to the market, you own something, I put a price on that, you're happy with that, we exchange. That's markets. But if it's a public good or a service, such as clean air, or fresh water, or law and order, you can't have markets for that. Love, friendship. I mean, there are no love and friendship markets. You can argue about. But you know what I mean. So the point is that there are certain things which lend themselves to economic. There are certain things which just lend themselves only to valuation in the broadest possible human sense. I value friendship. I value relationship. I value my daughters, etc. Then there are others that lend themselves to, well, yes, of course I value clean air and fresh water. I have no idea how much I would pay for it. I mean, what is the cost of clean air if there's a manufacturer other than God? I don't know. I mean, I've just come back from a diving trip. I know how much an oxygen cylinder is worth and so on, but I wouldn't be able to figure out what's the value of clean air not produced by a natural system. So there are certain things which you just can't value. There are other things which you kind of can value but can't do so economically. There are yet other things which you can value, you can understand their value in economic terms, and you can ascribe a monetary equivalent to that, saying, well, yes, I mean, if you didn't have bee-based pollination, sure, you'd still get wheat and rice and a few other crops which don't use insect pollinators, but you wouldn't get fruit, and you'd have to go around personally or by hand pollinating. This happens. Somewhere in the Teeb library, there's a picture of a lady climbing a ladder in China, pollinating painstakingly, flower by flower, pollen grain by pollen grain. So yes, there are alternatives. And you might even argue that GDP grew because she was paid. I wouldn't suggest that as the answer to this, but crazily enough, that's our system, right? We don't count the value of insect pollinators, but we know what the cost of not having them is. And we know that that cost can be measured. So yes, not having insect pollinators, not having bees has a huge cost of the order of $200 billion. That I would value, notwithstanding, there is no way of taking bees to market other than renting beehives to farmers. That does happen in a small sort of way in the US and elsewhere. Farmers go around with beehives to help and charge for the service of pollination. So really there's a whole area, there's a whole sort of ladder of the intuitive and public nature of the good or the service we are talking about versus its ability to be measured. If it's measured, its ability to be measured in money terms. If it's measured in money terms, then its ability to be rewarded or compensated. And then finally, its ability to be traded, as in many buyers, many sellers. And as I said to you earlier in this morning, that even when we talk about the so-called market-based mechanisms, and PES is considered, Payments for Ecosystem Service, a market-based mechanisms. Well, the reality of the fact is that there was a study done recently which looked at numerous PES schemes around the world. 97% had a government on either one side or both sides of it. Now, what kind of market is that? It's basically mainly two senior government officers sitting together and deciding what's a fair bargain between the two of them. That's really what's happening. So I would believe in using that anyway, even if it's not a proper market, because yes, that incentive or the disincentive of farmers being paid to change agricultural practice, because yes, they will suffer, but at the same time, city folks downstream will get cleaner water, or the municipality will have to pay less for cleaning the water before it passes it across. That's a market-based mechanism because it uses an economic estimate, but it's not a marketplace. It's basically a deal between two municipalities, one above the other.
Other questions about some of the analytics and ethics of valuation? Because if not, we'll move on to, can you go to the microphone if you have a question? Thanks. Please go up. Yes.
Yeah.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, just a question about where do people fit into the ecosystem? Are we not an integral part of the ecosystem rather than sitting outside? And if that's the case, in our presentation this morning, we saw the cultural focus on the environment. So when we're looking at a validation system or looking at valuing nature, where does the social, economic, environmental and cultural aspects come into that validation? And if we actually acknowledge that as part of a valuation system, can that not be the carrot for corporates and business rather than the stick?
It certainly is a risk. So firstly, why do we embark on this? I think the main reason we embark on valuation is because, as with everything, valuation must have a purpose. And its purpose is to provide justification and to provide method in order to conserve nature. So if that is your purpose, clearly if you've designed a mechanism or designed a marketplace which defeats your own purpose, then you made a mistake, and it's worth backtracking on that. So that's the first point. Always decide the purpose of valuation before you engage the valuation. That's not me saying it, but everyone from Collier and Mailer in 1974 and others who know more about this than I do have said so as well. So purpose of valuation is number one. Secondly, to understand the means, the mechanism of the change. In your theory of change, you will realize very quickly that one of the reasons why policymakers are unable to grasp what many of us are saying in this room is because we are not saying it in a way that translates into policy. And whether we like it or not, economics has become the language of policy. It's become the currency of policy. And therefore, presenting a case not only in absolute terms, not only in ethical terms, but sometimes in economic terms, makes a huge and powerful dent in the thinking of the policymaker to move him to the direction that you want, actually to achieve the purpose of the valuation. So it's kind of you might say it's a circular argument. You want to go there, you design the communication system, you choose the valuation, and then you go there. If you were in the kind of society, a naturist society, a society that believes in nature as a kind of Mother Earth, for instance, if we were all Bolivians for the sake of argument, we wouldn't be having this discussion because we believe nature is Mother Earth, we believe in conservation, and we hate those terrible miners who are ripping up and raping Mother Earth and so on and so forth. So there's a different kind of dialogue out there. And there you wouldn't need to argue about the economics of nature. You would just conserve. And if conservation wasn't happen, you would take out demonstrations and there'd be big fights and all that stuff. So that's a different form of social response. We are in a different society. We like to believe in conservation. We know it's good, but we are tied to a belief in human well-being, which itself is expressed in economic terms. We vote politicians in power. We build businesses to create that economic value. We are tied to the system. Must play the instrument we've got. That's the situation. Sorry, that's not me. That's Saul Bellow, by the way. Myself is thus and so, must play the instrument you've got. So there we go.
All right. Thank you, Pavan. We have a question here and another one over here. And two over there. Yes, please.
So I have two aspects I just wanted you to elaborate on a bit. You were talking about the different ethical standards that people might apply to thinking about nature as something that you can price or value, and it was difficult to say. You were arguing, I believe, that if a government is part of that, is sitting on one side of that table, or both sides, that it's not actually, it can't be thought of in terms of market value. I would say that there's lots of countries where the concept of what can be marketable is very different anyway. For example, a socialist state with complete healthcare for all, and America. So I believe that perhaps it's not whether it can. You couldn't always say that a government means that it's not marketable. My second comment was just in relation to the discounting, with the idea of was it 1.4% discount being acceptable. Surely that's like what Kim said earlier about being a little bit sustainable. You can't, surely having any kind of discounting in the long run is going to be fundamentally unsustainable. I would argue, wouldn't you say that you couldn't, anything that takes a resource, whatever that resource is, if it's a natural resource, without any plan to put that back into the system, is fundamentally doomed, surely?
Your first question first, which is on the healthcare thing, and I love the US healthcare example, because that's actually, interestingly enough, a nice way of understanding the difference between price and value. A good healthcare system will deliver value in terms of healthcare at a reasonable price. The American system delivers price with no value. So there's a difference between value and price. I think the American healthcare illustrates as much as nature does. Your second question is a deep one, because it is a question of how much is enough for well-being. So take a situation where you're not in a society where, which is not populous, has a large amount of natural capital, and is actually at a level of well-being which is good for society, and people accept that, and politicians find that comfortable, and so on. And then compare that, maybe like New Zealand, for instance, and compare that to another society where actually there isn't enough for all. There are large, dense populations. Nature is scarce, and nature is a supplier of livelihood. And it's quite difficult in that kind of context to sort of prevent access to forests for harvest. Then the question arises, okay, what kind of harvest? Is there a problem if people collect sticks and wood for their fireplace to cook? Well, clearly not. That would be unethical to suggest that. Okay, then is it a problem for them to cut bamboo because it's useful to make baskets and stuff like that? Well, probably not, because bamboo grows back. Then you have to say, well, is it okay if they clear a small amount of land out here or out there to grow some wheat and rice? Well, you might again argue, probably not, but you get a bit worried about, is this okay, is it not? And so on. So it's really a ladder of needs that, oh, sorry, that's not a good phrase. It's really more a series of needs that you have to try and meet to achieve basic human well-being. But at some point, you've got to take a call on what the purpose is that is being met by this use of nature. Sustainable use, slightly unsustainable use, and sometimes grossly unsustainable use. And if you see a situation where there's grossly unsustainable use on the one hand and only financial profit on the other, as the quid pro quo, then I would completely agree with you. That's a stupid choice. That can't be done. But I would argue where A, sustainable use is engaged, and B, where slightly unsustainable use, but with a social purpose is being engaged, I would say those are probably acceptable. Now, all this is me, right? There's no rule book which says this. This is just my personal ethics, which tells me that this is okay. That's all. And I think that's really partly what it comes down to. It is very much. Valuation is about ethics, and discounting is a further step in ethics in that direction.
Thank you, Pavan. Yes, we'll take two more questions perhaps on this subject, and then we'll move to some of the policy issues. Please.
Kia ora. I'd like your comments on the notion of offsetting, and by putting a value on things like the assimilative capacity of water, and nutrient budgeting and nutrient trading around catchments, where you have a small stream that's totally overloaded with nutrients, but the farmer's planted something on the other side of the catchment where the water body is all one. And the dangers of putting those prices of things like what is the value of a tree, and a developer comes into a council and says, you've valued this tree at $6,000, so here's $8,000 and I want to chop it down. So I'd just like some comments on about the dangers of that.
There are dangers.
offsetting.
Very good.
Yeah, well,
Very good.
very good point. And the number one danger is, have you read TEEB? Because the typical problem is confusion between price and value. And people don't seem to get it. I mean, the instinct, and just imagine why. Now, the reason most people don't understand the difference between price and value is because they're so used to prices and not values. Because today's psychology, today's ethos is a market-based ethos. We are more or less sort of persuaded by television, by broadcasting, advertising, marketing, to believe that the world is a marketplace. And that is the current sort of belief system where people are actually looking to markets to solve social problems, and that is wrong. It does not happen. Any serious economist will tell you the purpose of markets is not to solve social problems. So don't look to them to solve social problems. Markets will not address the distribution of goods and services. Markets will not solve issues of the kind that we would have. Therefore, it is important when you are using, again, the purpose of valuation. If the purpose of the valuation is to conserve nature, then you have to ensure that that valuation is achieving its purpose. And if instead it is merely becoming an instrument being misused in the hands of some petty criminal to convince some half-sensing bureaucrat to do something wrong, well, I'm afraid that's not acceptable. Yeah.
It is a mechanism that local government is definitely going down that track. And
Well, please stop them. I mean,
Well, I'm trying, but yeah, I mean, and I agree with you that there is definite values, but there was a situation whereby the potential to farm was bought off a farmer, so that he didn't do any put any nutrients into the catchment. So I mean, they're even now paying for the potential to farm, or to stop people farming, so that they don't actually. So
Well,
they are using.
Okay, so we need to go into the detail of that. But in other situations, I've seen where there are payments for ecosystem services. I mean, whether it's Catskills in the US or the example in China, or another 20 of them that are there in the TEEB reports. It's not the case that there are substantial miscarriages of justice being done. I mean, I have issues with market systems where, for instance, seeds are not seed saving is not permitted to farmers because they've purchased the seed from a particular company. And then I have serious ethical issues with that. And especially so because you cannot actually pin down in the secondary marketplace, or if you're buying from grain silos, you cannot actually decide, where did you buy this? Which company did I buy these seeds from? And to me, things like, drawing water from a public water source, or the ability to save seeds from crop that you've grown, I think these are fundamental human rights. We have a right to feed ourselves and clothe ourselves. So why should any economic system or market system stop you? If it's stopping us, then that's the problem, as I see it.
Thank you, Pavan. Question here, and then over here.
Hello, Pavan. Very grateful for your insights. And actually, welcome to Wellington again. Your name, Pavan, windy Wellington. There's a capital question as well. Actually, mine's an analytical question, and perhaps a bridge one that would perhaps be useful in the policy discussion later on. You see, you have made this leadership through TEEB is so radical and such a huge shift for everybody that if you reinterpret it and say, okay, what does it mean for an economist? Now, you've said very clearly that policy is the language of choice for policymakers, and you clearly have made a very clear statement, and I completely respect that it's through institutional change that real behavioral change occurs. But my question is actually, how does the nature of economics itself should be changing? Now, I've been reading earnestly about behavioral economics and the responsibility of, let's say, nudge and post-nudge as well. What's going on here is more responsibility is expected of the population. And also it's expected of the economists to communicate it in a language that's relevant to the n equals 1, as being said. So How does the analysis change in that regard? How does the valuation models change in that regard? That would be really interesting to know.
No, you hit a very important point, which is actually a very old point as well, which is that we don't understand, as of now, we still don't understand enough about the nature of value, nor indeed about the value of nature. And actually, the person who brought this to his writings was Adam Smith, as far back when he talks about in his book, so-called diamond water paradox, where he talks about some things having huge value in exchange, such as a diamond, but not much value in use, and then talks about water, in fact, as having a lot of value in use, but not much value in exchange. So this problem is there in terms of the fundamental issue between what's valuable and what's highly priced. Markets do not necessarily reflect value, they reflect demand and supply. That could be for all kinds of reasons. And I think the other thing is the boundary for what is called economics, unfortunately, has been defined too narrowly. And the reason for that is historical. Now, I'm talking about more than 100 years ago, when the whole construct of modern macroeconomics was put together. The general equilibrium theory basically rests upon formulae, which in turn rests upon certain simplifying assumptions, such as that individuals are value optimizers, value maximizers, and that they have full information about all aspects of markets. And you need those assumptions to be able to construct the models, to be able to predict macroeconomic variables. Now, if you're a scientist, if you're a natural scientist, then you would say, well, theories are theories, conduct experiments. If you find them to contradict theory, then abandon the theory, think of another one. Well, that's what happens in physics and chemistry and so on, but that has not happened in economics. Because there are any number of experiments which prove that individuals are not value maximizers, and sometimes don't, and they sometimes follow not information and best information, but just what you are doing or whatever. And they are certainly not purely selfish in the classical sense of the word. Ask any mother, what is selfishness? How can you be selfish with your child? Or ask any friend and so on. So, we have lots of assumptions built into the basics of the classical models, which, haven't really been challenged. And I guess you're right to point out that this challenge is required. And behavioral economics and environmental economics and ecological economics are just all parts of that challenge at one level. But I feel sad that they are branded with names. I feel sad that they're not just called economics, and this is just a widening of economics to a more intelligent science.
So the reform of economics is what's required.
It certainly is, yeah.
Yes.
As well.
Yes.
So there's a kind of combination of understanding that, yes, we are oversimplifying issues in economic theory, and at the same time an understanding that, we are, in that oversimplification, creating this boundary where we consider natural capital, human capital, and social capital in that order as kind of outside the realm of economics. And the reality is it's not, because any capital, any form of asset or wealth that generates income in the future, by definition, it's economics, right?
All right. We have a final question here, and then I think we'll move on to some policy issues. I should also say we've started at 3:30 rather than at 3, so my intention was to go until 5, if that's agreeable to people. People who have to go early, please feel free to do so, but we'll go as long as there's some questions.
Hello,
Finishing
I was
at
just
5.
wondering what you feel, your honest opinion around stated preference methods. You've highlighted methods such as contingent valuation and choice modelling. Given that they're not really, that people are just stating their preferences, how valid are they to be developing policy? We certainly can use these tools, but they're not actually how people act, how they perceive they might act, and they may lack credibility because people just put any old number, which is not necessarily reflecting their values, and they may not even understand the problems or the values that they're trying to convey. So I just want your opinion on how the validity of those methods.
Could you just perhaps say a
Yeah,
few words
what he
about
means by
what stated
so
preferences
thank you for the question.
are?
What he means by stated preference, there are methods of valuation where you are figuring out what something is worth based on what people are paying for the asset compared to another asset, hedonic pricing. So that would be a revealed preference. The preference for, as I mentioned, a flat overlooking Central Park in New York versus a preference for a flat identical to the earlier one, except that it's 2 streets away. So that's a revealed preference. One will be worth $2 million, the other one $1 million. So that's a revealed preference. But a stated preference is, I'm asking you, how much are you willing to pay per year to the government as a charge to conserve the kiwi? And you're saying, well, $100. And I'm saying, good. And I'm writing that down and so on. So the question, and this is an example of the other kind of method, which is contingent valuation or stated preference is broader than contingent valuation is one of them. Choice modeling is where you ask a community. I kind of prefer that because at least there's a meaning, there's a purpose there. That if they are saying X together, then they will probably do what they say because they've all said it in front of each other. Contingent valuations and stated preference of the polled kind, where you just send a little questionnaire or you ask people to log onto a website, you have to be really careful how you design the questionnaire for it to be meaningful. And frankly, and to answer your question, I have come across hundreds of contingent valuations which I think are just rubbish because they just haven't put thought into the design of the question. So you ask, how much will you pay for the kiwi, the bald eagle, the dolphin, the Indian tiger, blah, blah, blah. By the time you end all those questions, you'll probably end up with a massive number. You would probably say $100, $50, $50, $100, $10, et cetera. I add that up, and then I take that bill to your wife saying, is it okay for Jonathan to pay this much? Yeah. And you can see the consequence of that, right?
Yeah, she'd probably say pay more, but
well, whatever. Or maybe the other way around.
I'd be the one who'd be saying we can't afford it.
Right. So this is the challenge. So before you go about those kinds of methods, you really need to model for the selection of households whom you've queried, the household spending pattern, and what fraction of money of their incomes they are willing to put aside for philanthropic purposes. Then within that philanthropic purpose, you need to model and understand what percentage is for philanthropic natural conservation purposes, and so on. And then within that, how much is for local and known species, as in a kiwi, valuable here, a tiger in India. The reverse, how much would the average Indian pay for a kiwi? Not a lot. Or conversely, I don't expect you to pay that much for an Indian tiger either. But the point is, you need to go into that kind of depth if you're constructing a questionnaire. If you do not know the profile of the household spending pattern and its willingness, its propensity for philanthropic spending, how can you put in a question as in how much will you pay for this species or that species? So this is the problem with most of these contingent valuation stated preference questionnaires. The design is just hopeless.
Just a couple of follow-ups on that, Pavan. I mean, one of the problems with stated preferences is an equity issue. I mean, asking poor people how much they'd be prepared to pay is you're obviously going to get a different answer to asking someone like you. And if you don't recognise that, then you're operating on a very false assumption.
False premises.
The other issue here, amongst many, is that willingness to pay. The evidence is that people give a different answer to the question willingness to accept. So you've got loss aversion and status quo bias and other things coming into play, prospect theory and all that. So,
but having said all that, there are other methods of valuation. So hedonic pricing, cost-based methods, production approach, where you sort of, like in the case of bees, pollinators not being there, produces X amount of fruit valued at Y. If they were there, it'd be X dash and Y dash. So there are all kinds of other ways of valuing things, or income-based measures, or surrogate market or market measures and so on, where something does have a market price, and you can work it. So there are thankfully lots of methods of valuation. So whilst I remain a healthy skeptic when it comes to contingent valuations and stated preference methods, especially the survey kind, where usually some project senior or some PhD student is trying to get a quick study done, and that leads to a very unsatisfactory outcome. But I think thankfully there are enough methods of valuation, alternatives, which can be used, which are less subjective.
So part of your advice here would be that we should actually experiment with a range of techniques.
Experiment with the range of applicable techniques.
And contrast. And
not every technique applies to every situation, obviously, but there are usually more than one that apply to most.
All right. Well, I suggest we press on to some of the policy issues that your work raises. And obviously, if you think about this globally as well as nationally, we have made some progress in putting some prices on some negative externalities, or in regulating some negative externalities in various ways, air pollution, etc. But others other issues we've made very much less progress on.
Yeah.
And in some cases, we simply haven't even recognized that there was something valuable being provided by an ecosystem. From a policy point of view, Pavan, what do you see as the primary challenge to making progress in terms of market mechanisms, regulatory frameworks, and so on? What do you see as the primary challenge, and how can we overcome or chip away at that challenge?
Well, actually, that's not one question, but many, because as you know, because actually there's a whole range of challenges. To an extent, the challenge at the policy level is about justifying an environmental response, a response to an environmental problem in terms of some fundamental policy which people, the population and corporations believe in. So if there is a problem of freshwater scarcity or floods and droughts, in that case, providing a prescription which says restore upstream upland ecosystems so that they can reduce floods and droughts and improve the availability of freshwater. That could be a more acceptable response than just coming in and saying, conserve biodiversity, it's really important, let's restore forests. So to some extent, it's a question of framing the policy question in a way that elicits the right response. And sadly, and even though it's quite obvious, very often we don't see that being done. So that's problem number one, which is the framing of the policy question. And the second is alternatives, because there will always be interest groups, there will always be pressure groups, there will always be commercial interests who will choose choice one versus choice two. You might be Indonesia and at the national level, very strongly committed to conservation, even at the province level, very strongly committed to conservation. And then at the district level, it's not the president or the governor, but the Bhupati who decides that actually, unless I sell X amount of forest to my businessman friend, I'm not going to make the money I need to be able to, reward the local community to get re-elected next time. So there you have it. It's different layers of political decision-making are informed by different incentives and disincentives. And it's quite important to recognize that reality and also work around it. And recognize how do we change incentives and disincentives at each of the respective levels. And then finally, it's a question of understanding the extent, and I think this leads us maybe to our next stage, but I'll just mention it now, which is that to a large extent in today's world, and I sorry to disagree with you, Jonathan, but on one point in your earlier session where someone had commented, I forget who, about politicians today being followers, not leaders. I tend to subscribe to that, and I'll explain why, with apologies to any politicians in the audience, which is that if you look at the report card of today's politician, it's basically determined by broadly four things. One is campaign financing, because you need that. Secondly, by GDP growth, because people measure your performance based on that. Thirdly, by jobs, as in do you have high or full employment or not. Fourthly, budget management, as in do you have a huge fiscal deficit? How well did you manage the budget, the fiscal deficit? And campaign financing, corporations. Jobs, basically 70% corporations globally. GDP growth, 60 to 70% corporations globally. And of course, fiscal deficit, well, corporation taxes. So as a politician almost anywhere in the world, you are, because you need ticks in your report card, you are looking over your shoulder to the corporation. And you are looking over the shoulder for guidance, if you like. Will this policy of mine make a positive, neutral, or negative impact on the private sector? And if it's negative, you'll probably say, bad idea, let me think of something else, or stall, or delay. And unfortunately, a number of environmentally friendly policies or policies to correct environmental damage tend to fall into that box of negative P&L implication for corporations. And of course, there are a whole host of reasons, including externalities, why this happens. So in a sense, I'm kind of going towards our next topic, but there's a strong link between one and the other.
Sure. All right. Some questions. Yes, Simon.
Simon Terry, Sustainability Council. It's a very good introduction to the question I was going to put, because you've already stressed that the receiving environment is a very important context for how these ideas fall. In a world where particularly Western democracies since the 1980s have been on a deregulatory zeal path and a growth of those vested interests that you've pointed to, you've got to ask, when these ideas hit, is it going to be interpreted as, oh, yes, of course, we need to back off business as usual and back off the environment and put those taxes on that you're talking about? Or if governments don't act, as this idea moves forward, the risk is that it's co-opted and you get a policy package promoted by vested interest that said we need to value everything. We need access to those things once we've valued them. We need to be able to own them, and then we need to be able to trade them, and ultimately we need to be able to offset in other areas against them. They may be extremely valuable, but we need to be able to offset as long as that's a greater valuation overall. And you get in the kind of games that I've tracked in various areas where the valuation methodologies are gamed, as you would well know. The comment I'm seeking from you is, given the risk of the receiving environment in the current Western English-speaking democracies being so highly driven by vested interests and resistant to these changes, what are the caveats, the health warnings, the things that you would have to set as absolute bottom lines to even consider going down this track?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the question. In sense, this is a key question, because this is what my checklist is about, which is the 5 things that you must do to get valuation right. Number 1 is you must have the purpose of the valuation clear. Do not value any ecosystem service anywhere merely because this is interesting, isn't it? Because that's recipe 1 for disaster, because somebody or the other will find it interesting because it's profitable to convince some policymaker to make some stupid change, which then has huge negative consequences for society and nature. So number 1, get the purpose of the valuation very clear. Why value? Number 2, it's got to be context specific. Do not make any generic sort of statements about valuation. Context specific, as in this is being valued because we have a problem of severe deforestation leading to floods and droughts, and therefore potential desertification. Or this is being valued because we have a cost to coral reefs and there's huge ecotourism there. Or this is being valued because this is the last remaining stronghold of that particular species and there's significant potential value of people's absorption and commitment to the species, or whatever it is that reason is. So I think this is critical. Location specificity is another issue, because people very often make generic valuations saying water from forest is worth X, so we're giving you that many dollars, now give us the forest. Or some equally stupid generic comparison. Everything has to be location specific when you're valuing, and it's a huge risk to do what is called benefits transfer, which means, oh, this is a rainforest. I know a rainforest in Brazil which generates ecosystem services. It's valued at X dollars per hectare. I'll use that number. Well, I'll be conservative. I'll multiply it by 0.66, just conservative. This is all rubbish. So basically, you have to value what it is that you're valuing. Which particular rainforest is valuable to whom makes a huge difference. And the other is scaling, as in, I found an area of rainforest which was worth X according to my student who did a study 5 years ago, and I'm just applying inflation factor now for 5 years, and I'm extending that value to this entire forest. No, not possible. You can't do that either. So this whole issue of being context-specific, having the purpose clear, being context-specific, being location-specific is important. Thirdly, policy-based. So you're valuing in the context of policy A, as in business as usual, nothing changes. Then some policy change is happening. So you need to be clear as to what policy are you changing to compare value in scenario 1, as in business as usual, versus scenario 2. In other words, if you are going ahead with valuation and you have the purpose clear and the context is clear and the location is clear, and you're saying, I'm valuing this because I'm valuing this in a policy change where now we are rewarding concessions to this land to everyone. You can't be just that one businessman who gets the concession if he's come to you claiming that he's got $100,000 and that's more than the worth of the property, give it to him. Because then the point is, so will the next businessman come with 100,000 and the next one and the next one. So the policy has to be that, yes, we are clearing all forests at the rate of $100,000 per block, for the sake of argument. All right, write that down as a draft policy, put it up for approval, see if it flies. Right? So you have to have a policy context clear, because it can't just be a one-case situation there. Then we have to be, I think, conscious of the marginal cost versus the total cost. Very often people come out with these blanket statements of, the total cost is X. Well, you're not talking about the total cost. You're talking about increasing or decreasing a small part of probably an ecosystem. And you have to look at it in terms of the marginal cost versus the marginal benefit. So these are some of the health checks that you need to do for any valuation to be truly purposeful, context-specific, location-specific, marginal, and policy-based and scenario-based, essentially. And if you don't do these, then you will end up with a problem.
All right, Pavan, thanks. Question over here.
Thank you, Pavan. My question is actually more in regard to the purpose of valuation, particularly in a business setting. We're seeing some of the major accountancy houses around the world starting to say that up to 80% of a company's total value is actually off the books. That is, that it's not financial value, it's other forms of value, such as the ecosystems that it's in, the value of its people, etc. We're also seeing quite a growth in disclosure reporting, such as frameworks like the GRI and more recently the integrated reporting model, which has actually become compulsory on the South African Stock Exchange. Yep. And a lot of that is shareholder driven. My question to you is, do you see or anticipate a trend in the use of this form of valuation that you're talking about and actually driving decision making at a board level within companies, or if not, why not?
You know, the valuation by corporations of nature, unfortunately, is being sold to them as something that is for profit, as in an activity that will make you more profitable in the future. I think there's a huge risk of propagating that lie, because it is a lie. There are certainly circumstances in which you can reduce your risk. Risk is what can happen to P&L, so your costs can go down as a result of being more careful with the use of natural resources upon which your business is dependent. If you're an agricultural commodity buyer, then you have a huge risk that the farms from which you source go dry because of climate change, so you've got to worry about climate change, sure. That's one thing. But just to say that valuing nature is going to somehow improve your bottom line is not necessarily true. But what is true is that as a business, you are using resources, typically. You are certainly using energy, that has a cost, that has a potential climate impact. You're probably using fresh water. You may or may not be, in some way or the other, causing land use change somewhere along your value chain. You have impacts, right? Don't stop at dependencies. And I keep saying this to the people who are constantly projecting valuation based on the dependencies argument, that we are dependent on ecosystem services. Sure you are, but you also have impacts on ecosystem services. Value those, because those impacts, if they are negative, are your costs of doing business as usual. And today these costs are called externalities, and yes, there's 7 trillion of externalities and so on and so forth. And what is it? It is a free lunch where you can make private profits at public costs. So how long do you think free lunches last? Forever? I mean, there was one famous US president, Abraham Lincoln, right, who said you can fool some of the people all the time, all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And I think the externalities and the free lunch that it involves for corporations around the world, game over. It's just getting too late to keep doing that, and it's just too expensive.
So from a policy point of view, Pavan, should governments like New Zealand government and so on be actively encouraging business organisations to report, not merely on the normal financial basis, but to include a clear identification of their environmental impacts?
Absolutely.
And put some sort of prices on those impacts?
So, of course, when I ask for this, I know that we are not yet ready in all businesses. We are in some. We are certainly, companies like Puma have done this already. I think we're going to go on to our next topic of conversation, but that's fine. So companies like Puma have already engaged in the valuation of their impacts on society through the production of shoes and shirts. And they know how much cotton is used for the shirt, so they know how much water impact there is. They know how much rubber is used, so they know how much water impact there is. They know how much the energy use is, so they know what the climate impacts. They know how much pollutants they do in their leather tanneries, therefore impacts their waste impacts, et cetera, et cetera. All of these are measurables nowadays. And I think the important thing is for industries globally, whether it is coal-fired electricity or whether it is cattle ranching or whether it is cement or whether it's steel or whichever industry, the big players in that industry, to pull together for their industry and set up benchmarks and standards. Because today there's enough valuation methodology, enough technique, enough technology, enough knowledge to help do that. So it is possible today for a business to disclose its impacts. Now just let me point out some of the numbers there. Industries had impacts, which I mentioned to you, coal-fired power in Eastern Asia, $450 billion. There aren't 450 coal companies in China. There's a much smaller number. So we're talking about impacts of companies, or indeed any of the others, or for that matter, Puma, $250 million worth of impacts. The kind of impacts we are talking about on nature and therefore on society through the negative impacts of corporate business activity, normal business. There's nothing illegal about this. These impacts are in the hundreds of millions of dollars or even in the billions of dollars, right? So Jonathan, today in our financial statements, in our typical corporate reporting package, a financial reporting package, you would disclose directors' bonuses, which are in a few millions of dollars. You would disclose contingent liabilities and potential impact of court cases, which could be in tens or $50 million or $100 million. But you will not disclose externalities, which you know are in the hundreds and even billions of dollars. Now, why is this sensible? Are there any accountants in the audience?
I'm sure there are.
CFS? Why would you think it's a good idea to disclose millions and not billions?
But I mean, let's pursue that. Since we're talking about this, if you take an organisation like Exxon or BP or Shell, if they were to put a realistic price on carbon, social cost of carbon, and put that in their books, then for BP, rather than say producing a profit of £10 billion a year or £20 billion, whatever it is, it would be
a huge
potentially a huge loss.
Sure, it cost could almost definitely exceed their profits.
Which would then, of course, raise the question for shareholders: why are we, funding a company that's actually producing a net loss for humanity?
Yeah, this is the purpose of the valuation I'm asking for. I want shareholders to raise the question about: is it okay for me to be invested in a company who makes private profits for me while creating huge social costs for everyone else? I also follow my own discipline, which is always know the purpose of valuation before you ask for it. So I know the purpose, which is transparency about true cost.
But one further point on this, discounting will be absolutely crucial to that.
Of course.
So the risk is that they will put a low social price on carbon.
Okay, so very good point, Jonathan. So this is why it has to be done at an industry level. So it's not acceptable for BP to have one black box which says, here's my valuation methodology, and for Shell to have another, and for Exxon to have a third. Clearly, there has to be an industry standard. So to simplify, if you're just looking at the economic cost of 1 ton of carbon dioxide, Stern value from 2006, $85 a ton, right? Oh, fine, whatever his reprice now is, maybe $100 a ton. But there should be one number, as against I use 45, you use 150, somebody else uses 100, and so on. So clearly there has to be an industry standard. To certify that industry standard, you need some acceptance by a neutral body of valuers, such as what we have with the T Business Coalition, and such as finally I hope we will have with the accountancy bodies, looking at various methodologies and reports and surveys submitted to them saying, yep, we think this is the right benchmark.
Well, I'm very attracted to that proposition. Please, question here, and then I think there's one over here. Off you go.
Sorry, this was just a follow-on on yours, Jonathan.
Right.
And it has to be asked. Money is just a proxy. It's the expectation you can buy goods and services at some point in the future. Yep. Those goods and services are only produced by the doing of work. The doing of work is only done by using of energy. If we're peaking the supply of energy on this planet, per day supply, one can call it peak oil, it's a bit more complex than that. But if we're peaking the supply of energy on this planet, what's the underwrite of the money that you're talking about valuing the oil companies in?
He's working on two glorious assumptions. One is that it is always okay, it is always going to be okay to mine oil, mine energy, in other words. And second, that it will be always okay to have externalities and not be charged for them. Because at some point, the problem comes home to roost. Externalities do get internalized once in a while, right? I mean, everyone has heard about the BP disaster off the Gulf of Mexico. Immediate hit to market value of the share of the order of $70-odd billion, and provision by the company $20 billion. CEO has to resign. These are all costs to the corporation. So it was an externality measured at 60 to 300 billion. Dr. Costanza and his group did that study. But yeah, I mean, if someone had done that study in advance, and if they had not responded to that, that would be questionable.
Sorry, that wasn't quite where I was going. Where I was going was, if we're going to pay for things, but we're all expecting to do things with a natural resource, which is the finite energy, and it isn't there to do the paying for the things, how are we going to do the things, and how are we going to value things? It's sort of a bootlaces thing, or a bit of Boolean algebra when you get to it.
There's a premise there that probably is invalid, because we don't have finite energy. With the sun and so on, we have infinite.
Well, even sun's not infinite, but it's sufficiently high.
Sufficient for our purposes.
Sufficient for our purposes, anyway. Yeah. So the question is, what kind of energy? Yeah, sure.
Yes, over here.
I just wanted to come back to something that you said before. You said that part of the problem in policy making is that the politicians always look over their shoulder to big corporations to, fund their, their campaigns and so forth. And I mean, Al Gore actually put it a bit more bluntly. He said that that our democracy has been hijacked. He just recently said that in an interview. So, since this is about policy making, do you have ideas how to tackle that? Because I mean, right now, a lot of the policies are, they're basically taken one-to-one from these lobbyists, and which prohibits, incorporating a value of nature into our policies. I was just wondering if you have ideas.
I mean, lobbying is very much a part of what I call Corporation 1920, today's corporation. We can go afterwards if anyone wants to ask why I call it 1920. But basically, lobbying today is the most valuable use of management time if you're a senior corporate CEO or officer. Because what you're doing is, if the football field is tilted in your favor, you're keeping it that way. If it's not tilted in your favor, you are tilting it in your favor. You're keeping competition out. You're keeping access to resources in. You're doing all the things by basically persuading policymakers to design a policy change or to keep a policy which is unbalanced or unfair. And that's hugely valuable for you as a company CEO and for your shareholders, because that's how you make profits. And of course there are externalities, but who cares for those? Because there are no rules about externalities. You don't have to report them. You don't even have to measure them. So there's a connection between why lobbying takes place. It is basically about securing financial profits and doing so in a way that really doesn't care much for the consequences or the costs. And to address that, now at the same time, there is good lobbying as well. And of course, I once met at Yale University a lobbyist for clean energy. I was delighted. I mean, we don't meet clean energy lobbyists very often. So I sat through his presentation and asked him just one question. So I said, how many of you guys are there? So he says, about 5. I said, 5? I said, in the whole of Capitol Hill? He says, yeah. And I said, okay, well then how many energy lobbyists are there? I mean, as in petroleum. He said about 550, sorry, about 3,550.
3,000, yes.
550,
3,000,
yeah. So there's 3,550 who are lobbying for coal and oil and gas, and there's 5 lobbying for clean energy. So now, of course, if the ratio were somehow reversed, it would be a different kind of world because US policies would be different. But this gives you the sense that, lobbying can be used for positive purpose. It just isn't today, and that's the problem. How do we control it? How do we manage it? Number 1 is disclosure. Number 2 is taking that disclosure to the next stage. And for instance, if an American coal the Association of Clean Coal, I think ACCE, put in an amazing campaign about clean coal and stuff like that to basically counter the Waxman-Markey bill in the US. And among the various claims they made was that people are calling up their congressmen to argue against such legislation, and that people prefer it on the basis of some study that was cooked up. So disclosure of those studies and public scrutiny and research by some intrepid journalists led to a complete demolition of that argument of the ACCE because it turned out to be fake. It was based on a cooked up study by one agency. So it's important to, in addition to controlling lobbying, and it was a lobbyist who was actually providing the study for that. That's all legal, by the way. It's allowed. All these things are allowed. But the point is, someone has to test that, to check it, to bring it to public scrutiny, to bring it out into the open. And I think that function of civil society is actually vital. So we need, together and countering lobbying, we need civil society actors. They need sufficient financing so that they can do their jobs properly. Finally, people, citizens. Citizens are critical. I mean, we are all citizens. It's funny how in today's market world we are called consumers, as if everything else we did is irrelevant, right? You consume, therefore you are. Otherwise, if you don't, then you're not. But no, I believe that whether I consume or not, I exist. I'm a citizen, yeah.
Pavan, just one quick point though. Even with good disclosure and with good intrepid journalists and whatever, the fact of the matter is the so-called clean coal lobby won.
They still won.
And they've won now for 20 plus years in the US against the whole weight of the international scientific community.
Yes.
Very strong lobbying by environmental groups, lots of citizen action. They're still winning.
Well, and the reason why you need both citizen action as well as what I call Cooperation 2020, a new kind of cooperation, a cooperation that is whose goals are aligned with society, a cooperation who, as a natural way forward, sees itself as a capital factory, not just a creator of financial capital for shareholders, but a creator of human, social, and indeed natural capital for the wider society, not just a seeker of financial profits, but a seeker of total value. And a corporation who trains people because it believes in creating human capital, a corporation that creates communities with its not just shareholders, which it does anyway, but also its suppliers, its employees, its local markets, conditions, and indeed its competitors, because it believes that's the right way forward, doing business as a community. So that kind of cooperation is yet to happen. And until that does, you will not see the end of the kind of negative lobbying that got ACCE and the so-called coal and oil lobbies to win and has been for the long time. So I think we need both, a combination of citizen action as well as a new kind of cooperation. And achieving that actually, to me, is the critical challenge of our times. I mean, we have to remember that 3/4 of the economy and jobs, 2/3 to 3/4, depending on country to country, is basically in the private sector. So you can keep arguing for policy change, you can keep arguing for whatever you want, but if you want economic direction to change and become a green economy, and if you want resource use to change and become resource efficient, then that's not going to happen unless corporations make that happen. And today's Cooperation 1920, is simply not geared to do that. Absolutely not geared to do that.
It also means we have to have transformative leadership within the business community, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Business leaders who understand the sorts of things you've been talking about today.
And set the example, They do set the example. But also, in addition to that, it needs people to appreciate what's being done, citizens, to appreciate that. Because if you look at today's leaders, whether it's Unilever, Paul Pullman, or Jochen Zeitz from Puma, or whoever it is who's in that list, or from my own country to the Tata Group, amazing stuff is being done by them, and truly moving in the right direction. But I did once a back-of-the-envelope calculation, just added up all their turnovers, including the $66 billion of, and I just, for the sake of being generous, I included Walmart in that because their chairman, when he interviewed with me, said that they wanted to go that route. Now, whether they succeed or not, we don't know, but the point is they wish to go there. I even added the $469 billion, I still remember it, turnover of Walmart. Adding all that up, I still came to an answer of about $700 billion, which is about 1% of the global economy. And then I multiplied that by 4 because they have value chains, and they typically control a fifth or a fourth of the value chain. That gave me 5% of the economy. What about the remaining 95% of the economy? That's where you need the politicians to argue and introduce the new policies. You need the accountants, the finance ministries, the tax departments, all of those.
We need some political leadership then.
As well, yes, as well. Some leadership will be needed, yes. True, he's got back at me on that one. That's right.
Question over here.
Yes. Pavan, hi. Yes. My name is Raf Manji. I'm from Sustento in Christchurch. I was one of the original developers of the true cost model back in 2000 and 2001 in London. And one of the jobs I did was also go and try and sell it to over 200 of the FTSE 250 companies. And in summary, they fell into two camps. Some of them said, I completely understand what you're saying, and it makes complete sense to me. Yes, we should pay the full cost of our business. But all of them said they would only do it if their competitor did it or the government provided regulation. And it's been interesting for me to watch over the last 10 years how long it's taken for that to happen. So it's quite interesting to see Puma being the first big corporation to come out and really take that on board. But I think we're missing a little disconnect here, and I want to ask a question to the audience. So how many people here have got shares in Fonterra? Right, no one? How many people have got shares in Contact Energy? A few. How many people have got shares in ANZ Bank? Okay, any fund managers here? Okay, this is the problem. How many people have got a KiwiSaver account? Right, you've all got shares in those companies. Now the problem we have, and look, I've been thinking about this for a long time. You can clap. I've been thinking about this for a long time. Is we have a disconnect in ownership. So we talk about corporations as if there's something different to who we are. We actually own all the shares in the corporations. It's just that we have a third party sitting in between, which is fund managers. So here we have KiwiSaver, which is a local kind of pension fund. But fund managers manage most of the investments globally, and they vote on everything they say, everything. Now, if we could cut that out, and we've got the technology to do it today, so imagine every AGM, every single shareholder, whether you had one share in a $300 billion company, was able to vote, then you might actually see those changes. So companies could say, hey, would you like us to have true cost counting? This is going to be the hit to the bottom line in the short term, etc. Then the shareholders could vote. The shareholders are the citizens. So I think that disconnect, and I think you're talking about it with your Corporation 2020 thing, needs to be bridged. And I think if we can do that, then we might see a little bit more pressure.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that, I don't know what the latest number is, but at one point, almost 70% of capital invested in equity was actually institutional. So, the people who own this Kiwi are not the ones who vote. It's actually the fund managers and their agents who are voting.
Right.
And that vote is based on 2% and 20% and other such factors.
But we can sit here and we'll complain about these companies without realizing we may own shares.
We are owners of those companies, and this happens, and we are. But the fact is, it's the intermediaries, what you're talking about is the intermediaries. And unfortunately, the intermediaries run to the same Corporation 1920 principles, which is the only thing that matters is shareholder profit, no matter that the shareholder isn't asked ever whether this is what they want. But they are working to the same principles of Corporation 920, optimize financial profits at the cost of anything. Doesn't matter really, so long as it's not illegal. But the point is,
they're doing it on behalf of the shareholder who is not actually having a voice.
Who doesn't subscribe to that belief. So we have a serious disconnect between the intermediary, who is also a Corporation 1920.
Sure.
As it happens.
So since the fund managers are so crucial in this, and since globally, there's probably only several thousand that really matter in terms of controlling, the trillions of investment. I mean, Pavan, to what extent have you been interacting with fund managers on these sorts of issues, highlighting the risks of them investing in companies that are not taking seriously the damage that they're inflicting?
I haven't. I gave up, actually. This is the truth. I mean, 4 or 5 years ago, I was focused very much on that and met many of them in London and elsewhere. But they just don't listen because they say, well, we have X amount of money, and this is what these are the rules and regulations by which we run. And yes, there is a fund, a separate fund. For those shareholders who are truly interested in sustainability, here's our sustainability fund.
And it's tiny.
And it's one tiny thing. Now, in some parts of the world, it's not tiny. The US is not small. It's like 12% of their total asset classes is sustainability positive or ethical in some way or the other. So sometimes the ethical and sustainability component of money is not small. That's good news, but it's still a fraction of the total equity in the marketplace, and that's the challenge. So they're going by the same old problem, which is we are not the decision maker, it's somebody else, and they're going doubly by and then that flows on to the CEOs. So, of course, leadership comes from within, not from without. So those CEOs who've led the charge to a different direction and are leading it are actually guided by common sense and a vision of the future, not by what their fund managers think. But even those CEOs, I can tell you, because I have spoken with some of them, are looking for ways of justifying their actions in terms of long-term shareholder value. There's only one company I know, which is Nestle, which has actually changed its memorandum and articles of association to make long-term shareholder value the purpose of the company. And therefore, shareholders who are not interested in that can't argue. But by and large, companies are held by institutions, be it fund managers or be it insurance companies or pension funds, mutual funds.
All right. Well, look, we've covered a range of issues so far. We've covered some of the valuation issues, ethical issues, a little bit on policy, something on business. We've talked now very recently about the role of citizens and so forth. It's 4:45. Unless there are other people, do you want to say?
Well,
you had a couple of tips.
I have two short films. So
yes.
we come back. Thank you for the fund manager question, and I'd like to catch up with you because True Cost is a very good initiative, which I'm supporting indirectly from my company. But I have two films which are basically pointing to the citizen as the source of power for change in the future. And what we've come to through various discussions is that CEOs will lead in the right direction, but then how do you make them follow? To create followership after leadership, you need policymakers. Policymakers and politicians will not listen unless citizens make them act. And indeed, some of the slower change companies will not listen unless citizens respond in a negative way to them. So then the question is, what did we in TEEB do to rope in the citizen? First thing we thought we'd write a TEEB for citizens, and we were advised by our marketing friends that that's a stupid idea, because people don't read books, silly, and so on. So then we put up a website, which is still there, but we didn't have enough money to put up a full string of websites, so it's basically called Bank of Natural Capital. It was meant to be much more than that, but it is what it is. And the other thing we did was, with Georgina's help, who's here in the audience somewhere, we put up a competition through a group called MoFilm. One of our advisors was a marketing CEO in India, a friend of mine, and we got her to nominate us, TEEB, as the NGO of the year. So they raised a film competition across the public, asking young filmmakers or aspiring filmmakers around the world to express in films, not more than 1 minute, what do they think is the value of nature? Why is it important? So we gave them literally a one-page brief and asked them to come back with a film and a little prize at the end of it. We got 150 entries. We found 50 of those entries good enough to really worth considering and voting for who is the top 5. Then we voted for a top 5 set of entries. And one of them actually won the Rome Film Festival Award. So this was unheard of up to that point. So this was actually people saying what they think of the value of nature. And I'd like to invite those 2 films. One is called Your Invoice, and the second one is called Little Things. Your Invoice, you'll see what it means. Can we have the 2 films, please, in sequence? Thanks.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes?
Hi, Mother Nature here. I'm here to collect for last month's nature usage.
Nature usage?
Okay, let me see. The sun rose and set. Oh, look at that. Every day. There was that cool breeze on Tuesday. And last week you stood at the rim of the Grand Canyon for that amazing view. Can't put a price tag on that, can you? Just kidding. We did. Here it is. And you're going to get credit for the tree you planted. That should just about offset all the electricity you used with that air conditioner. Let's just call it a wash.
Hey!
What? You do it to my house all the time. And I see you're running a little behind on your oxygen bill. I wouldn't let that continue very long if I were you, Mr. Johnson.
Well, I'm a little short this week, so
So, will that be cash or charge?
So this was one of the award winners, and it kind of gets the message across in a nice way, but perhaps a little slower, but at the end maybe more powerful is the next one, which is called Little Things, and this was the movie that actually won the Rome Film Festival Award. There you go. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's back to you.
Any final comments, questions? This is somebody here. Can you use the microphone just so people can hear, please? All right, so the question, why did Puma take on the accounting approach that you have talked about?
It was Jürgen Zeitz and his team. Jürgen Zeitz is quite a visionary, and he's been through a tough time with his company, and he realized that he wanted to leave a legacy more than just a profitable company, which he turned around, and it's doing well. And he realized that the key thing, around the same time, Teeb had just been published, the Teeb for Business, and someone in his team called Holly Dublin, had pointed out to him that, there is this approach, and he decided, yeah, that sounds like the right thing to do. It's just that. It was a CEO deciding this is the right thing to do. It is about externalities. Why on earth should I be the CEO and chairman of a company which does not measure its externalities, does not disclose them, does not represent to society the truth? I shall. And it was a tough decision for him because his board had to be brought around, and the company was undergoing a change of ownership at that time, was actually owned by a larger group. So it was not easy, and there were those on the board who thought this would be a disastrous move, it would create a potential liability, etc., etc. And he went ahead nevertheless. I mean, he was the executive chairman, so he went ahead nevertheless. And as a result, I think they've actually added, in this particular case, to their brand value. I know people who've told me that, they've heard what we've written about Puma, and they love the story, and therefore they bought something, which is a Puma brand, for the first time, because they wouldn't have thought of doing that. So, but it was, at the end of the day, it was about vision and right thinking, rather than any particular corporate driver that led him to decide to do that. And that's rare. That doesn't happen very often, as you know.
Question over here, Jeff.
Jeff Simmons from the Morgan Foundation. Wanted to ask a slightly heretical question about property rights. because we were talking about the quota management system earlier on in the day, which at the time really helped us manage our fish stocks, undoubtedly has been successful in that respect. But some might argue that the granting of property rights has since made it more difficult for us to manage marine reserves, sea lions, birds, Maui dolphins, all of which are, to some degree impacted by the fishing industry. Any view on using property rights to solve these problems and whether they can, have long-term negative impacts?
No, there are definitely many good examples, many good instances of property rights being used for addressing biodiversity loss successfully. So there are countries, the ALBA group of countries in Latin America, Bolivia, Ecuador, and a few others, who believe in the biodiversity problem as being a rights problem. They don't see the need for valuation for conservation. They rather believe give nature rights and treat nature as if it had rights and let only local communities have those rights. So there are situations where property rights are recognized. I think it's fair to say that there are many examples where community rights, if they are recognized, and management of local natural areas is given over to the community with some help being provided in terms of finance and so on, that outcome is very often better than an official or a government management. I remember a paper by Elinor Ostrom, the late Elinor Ostrom, Nobel Prize winner in economics, in which she had done a study of some 70, 80 examples each of community-managed reserves and government-managed reserves. And in fact, the net outcome in terms of measured quality of the reserves was actually better with the community-managed reserves than with the government. So there are clear cases where, as against intervening through policy which is constructed and delivered by governments, do it through the local community who lives there, respects that land as a common heritage or a common resource, a common pool resource, as she calls it, CPR, and may end up with looking after it much better than if you did otherwise and gave it either to private hands on the one hand or to the government on the other.
But I think part of the question there, Pavan, was the risks of privatizing certain otherwise common property resources. So by creating the particular regime we have for managing our fisheries with total allowable catches and then with quotas which are sold and you can buy and sell them, there are certain risks associated with that.
Sure. I mean,
I think that was what you're getting at, Jeff. Yes.
Yeah, and the main risk is how you size the quota. In any cap and trade system, it's not the trade that's the complicated bit, it's the cap that's the complicated bit. And one massive area where it was a bold step for the European Union Commission to set up the EU ETS, the European Union emissions trading scheme. And unfortunately, because of politics and negotiations and more politics and more negotiations, effectively what happened was there was too much credits granted. And the net result was, of course, and this was because companies argued back in terms of why these 2,500 companies should be limited in their emissions to that much, and they asked for limits which were more lenient. Net result is basically too much inflation, too much quota, if you like, and the net result is the value of carbon in the EU ETS has crashed. This is what happens when you have, it's kind of inflation, right? So it's a sort of, if you think of the carbon credit as a money, you've got the central bank having issued too much money, that causes inflation, and the asset prices crash, and that's exactly what's happened in carbon. The same problem can easily happen in any cap and trade system, be it for fisheries, or be it for nitrogen, or be it for anything. You just have to make sure that your calculations, whatever science tells you is a conservative number, be a little more conservative than that, and then pitch your level, pitch your overall cap at that level. That would work. But if you are pushed or negotiated or persuaded or bullied or whatever into a situation of greater leniency, then the chances are that won't work.
All right, final question over here, please.
I'm going to suggest we're dancing to an anthropocentric fiddle, basically. And what I want to take you to task on is a moral imperative for our fellow travellers. And I want to say this to you, that when you give consideration to indicators for the sustaining environmental health that we rely on, give a thought to our brothers and sisters. Give a thought to using extinctions as indicators. Give a thought to not devaluing natural capital but improving it, so that as you value it into the future, we understand that it has greater value because we place greater reliance on it because we don't want more extinctions. What I'm saying is any extinction from this moment on is unacceptable to us morally. And that should be part of the reckoning, and that should be fundamental to the basic ethics of this. And the other thing, when we look forward to future generations, it's not about providing enough for the people in the future. It's understanding our host and caring for her in a way that the people in the future can be instructed as to how to live here sustainably. And there's the elephant in the room, which is the number of us behaving badly. But the moral imperative of our fellow travellers must be in the picture. Thank you.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I also morally believe that all extinctions are wrong. But my believing that since the age of 10 hasn't made a toss of a difference to any policymaker in the world. So it's only in the last 10 years when I've been talking economics that they've finally moved the needle a little bit. So to me, the moral imperative which I faced 10 years ago was that do I engage this path knowing that I can make a difference and speaking the language of economics to people who understand that they're talking to an ex-managing director of Deutsche Bank and not just an NGO? That was a moral choice. I know the risks, my dear friend, I know the risks. But I know that if I don't say what I say to the people to whom I say it, then I'm making a moral choice to let the problem get worse. And that was a moral choice. Yeah.
Well, I think probably on that note, which is a very high note, and one which reminds us very acutely of the nature and magnitude of the damage we are inflicting on numerous species globally, and that we have already done over many, many centuries. On that note, I think we should wrap up. Pavan, I'm enormously indebted to you and the team of people that you brought together for the work that you have done over recent years, for the advocacy you have been providing, for your clear enunciation of the issues and the analytics, the ethics, the arguments, and for your willingness to take on, some very, very challenging issues in the centres of power and influence around the world. Thank you for your contribution to this event.
My pleasure.
It's been really fabulous. It's been a great privilege for me to be able to meet you and participate in this. Thank you very much for the people who've asked questions and for all the terrific work that I know many of you out there, if not all of you, are involved in various domains. And if we could conclude just by showing our appreciation for Pavan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. That's the end.